Welcome to the Educational Physics Podcast. I am your host, João Figueiredo. This podcast is all about education, pedagogy, mindset, and really any other nonsense that I think about during the week. Enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the Educational Physics Podcast. We will continue today with the topic of language, and we'll try to overlap the topic of language with the topic of trauma. We've been talking about those two ideas for a while now, for at least 5 or 6 episodes, and I really wanted to bring things together a little more this time around. First of all, let's address the topics of parenting, language, trauma, self-talk, and how all of this comes together when it comes to child development. It is important to understand that what we say to children has an impact. And Jeffrey Canada, he has this idea that he defends that whatever you expose a child to within the first 2 years becomes imprinted in them for the rest of their lives. I tend to believe that this is correct, to the extent of how that can be measured. Might not be 2 years, might be 4 years, might be 5 years. So there might be a bit of leeway there for us to correct course. I also don't know how powerful the imprint is in terms of if one thing is said that is not helpful or is not a growth mindset sort of, let's say that it doesn't use a growth mindset language. Does that become immediately imprinted for the rest of the child's life? Or is it more the case that repetition plays a role here, almost like language load? If we are exposed to the same sort of negative or positive language and words and ideas time and time again, that does become then imprinted in that person's personality. Is that the case? Is it the case that it requires repetition, or are there situations that are so serious, so damaging that one time is enough to cause perpetual damage? It's tough to know. And how do we recover from that damage? It's also tough to know. It depends on what caused it. It depends on the person. But I would say that if the first 2 years are crucial to the child's development, which they are on many fronts, not just language, but observed behavior, nutrition, sleep, all of this plays a role, and it's important that we understand what's at stake. A child that is exposed to negative talk or language around them all the time is a child that is developing negative self-talk. Because this is what's really important. It's not just what you say to a child, but it's also what you say around the child. So sometimes you might think that you're saying all the right things to your child when talking directly at them, but then you might have a toxic relationship around them. Or you might have a toxic relationship with yourself around them. Maybe you're trying to empower them, but really whenever you're facing difficulties or failures, you cave, or you feel frustrated, and maybe you swear, maybe you call yourself stupid or dumb, and does it really balance it off that you talk to that child in an empowering way, but then you talk to yourself out loud in a disempowering way? What do you think the effect is on the child? It's not positive, I can tell you that much. Children look at their parents and whoever their primary carers are as the primordial role models. We kind of all know this, but we don't know the intensity of that dependency. and it is very intense. There are several studies on how the child bonds with their fathers, for example, right from birth by, you know, experiencing skin on skin. When my kid was born, as soon as he was checked out and everything was okay, he came onto my chest, and I was not wearing any clothes from the waist up, and he was just on my chest, and we were just bonding skin on skin. Is that why we can be so affectionate today? Maybe. I didn't run the experiment otherwise. And I don't intend to have another kid and try and see what happens if we don't do skin on skin. But we do know that some kids didn't have that experience, and it does affect the bonding experience with their parents. Likewise, children who breastfeed for longer have a much closer relationship with their moms than those who don't. I'm not going to cast any judgment on those who decide to breastfeed, those who don't. I am pro breastfeeding, if you ask me. But I understand that it's a very specific and personal issue. But the studies do reveal that breastfeeding for longer than 6 months does benefit the child immensely, and the bond between child and mother. Now, back to the language issue. We might have that close bond, but that's likewise dangerous in a way, because to not have a bond with your parents is utterly traumatic, because it puts you in the world with no role model. So you will seek role models somewhere else, but the reality is that you might not find any suitable ones. On the flip side, once you have that bond with your parents, then you're looking up all the time. You're constantly observing, you're constantly listening, you're constantly modeling. So parents must be very careful as to how they conduct themselves, what they say, how they behave, what they say to each other, how they solve or resolve conflict. All of that matters, and all of that is of crucial importance to the child's development. Now, the reality is that, like I said already earlier, it's not just what you say to the child, it's also what you say around them. But behavior also plays a role into this, right? The way you behave around that child also matters. Do you eat well when you're trying to promote healthy diet for the kid, right? All these contradictions are picked up by the kid, the child. If the parents eat really badly and they have really bad self-care habits, and then they're trying to impose, really, because that's what's going to feel like, a healthy lifestyle on the kid, it's really going to feel like punishment to the child. Like, how come the adults get to eat whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want, and I have to eat my broccoli? It won't make much sense to the kid. So leading by example is a massive one. If you're a parent and you're not leading by example, you can expect much more resistance from your kid than you would otherwise. Now, of course, resistance is part of the game. That's how they explore boundaries, and that's how they explore the limits of their world, which is important, which they have to do. Otherwise, they don't really understand what limits are. The lack of boundaries and the lack of that resistance and that struggle will not result in a more confident kid. Quite the opposite. It will result in a more lost kid. So do establish your boundaries, and then do expect resistance. That's how they experiment with those limits. That's how they experiment with how dependable on you they can be. That is a test on you when they resist your boundaries. It's not necessarily just a test on your patience, but a test on your reliability. These kids are exploring how far they can go until you impose a boundary that is based upon safety and protection and longevity of the species, really, and then they will feel safe. So you resisting their resistance and you imposing your boundaries will actually create a safer environment for the child. It's how you go about this that makes a world of difference as well. So now language comes back into this. If you just snap and shout and scream and I don't know, like the extreme of hitting your child whenever they resist your authority, then you're creating a child that sees exploration as something to be punished. So you're going to create a fearful child, you're going to create a child that doesn't feel empowered to explore the limits of their freedom, really. And we all have to have those limits, but we all also have to have the safety of knowing that exploring those limits doesn't mean immediately punishment. As adults, we understand that law plays that role, right? So we have law because we have to know where the limits of our freedoms are. For me, it's quite simple. My freedom stops where your freedom begins. And if I infringe upon your freedom, I should expect either retaliation from yourself or from the law directly. And that's absolutely fine. I understand that social agreement that's been casted upon us over multiple generations. Children understand that as well, and that relationship starts with the parents, and then school, and then friends, and then love relationships and sexual relationships, and then work relationships. And those limits keep on expanding, but they are always present, and they must be. But we must empower the child with the opportunity to try again. So when I'm talking to my kid and I explain to him why he can't do this or that, I always do my very best to explain in a very calm way, so he doesn't feel like he's just facing some sort of violent retaliation. And I explain to him that it's not a no forever necessarily, it's a not yet, because we have to make sure that you're responsible enough to keep yourself safe before I let go of that role myself. This is why I find so important to give children small tasks and increasingly more challenging tasks around the house, for example. Can a child of 3 years of age chop up vegetables with your help? Yes, absolutely. Teach them how to hold the knife properly, safely, only around the handle, right? Don't the other hand, where should it be? Away from the blade, that's for sure, right? And teach them those things whilst you hold their hands, absolutely. So you're creating a boundary, which is I'm allowing you to, even empowering you to do this, but with my assistance, so one day I can trust you to just do it by yourself. It's important to give confidence, assign trust upon the kid. Having said that, you have to also question the way you interact with the world yourself. Do you get frustrated easily? Then you get frustrated at your child for getting frustrated? So there might be a disconnect there in terms of the example you're giving. Then the other idea here when it comes to language and how powerful it can be is this idea, which might sound a little bit hippie, but it's not, and there's value to it. And of course, sometimes all good things get corrupted, and then we start to feel like we're talking about some, esoteric thing. But words of affirmation are quite powerful, and they have to be used properly as well. We have to be very careful so we don't give blind hope to a child, which makes them reckless and overly confident. And You have to also acknowledge that words of affirmation will create an ego, and that's unavoidable. It's just what kind of ego you're creating. So, whilst I do believe that words of affirmation are powerful, I also believe in questioning these things and teaching children to question themselves, to question their behaviors, their attitudes, their shortcomings. So, on one hand, I do motivate my child with words such as, you can do this, and look what happens when you put effort into things, which is a growth mindset message. And I'm proud of you. That's a powerful one. Children are constantly seeking that validation. Don't deny them that if they actually pull through. Never deny them that. Always look them in the eye and say, hey, I'm proud of you. I see what you did there. Especially try to do that when it seems like they're not even looking for your validation. Maybe they're doing something by themselves in their bedroom and you're paying attention and you hear them say something that is quite, what's the word? It's quite mature, maybe, or it's quite evolved, or self-aware, or kind. Just go there. Take 3 steps, knock on the door, and tell them, hey, I'm proud of you. You know, children speak to themselves a lot, and there's a reason for that. They are practicing interactions with the world in the safe environment of their own virtual reality, which is their imagination. So children speak to themselves all the time because they need to practice those conversations. That's how they become aware of what to say, when to say it, how to engage with others, and how that makes them feel without the pressure of the actual social interaction. So then when they go into that social interaction, they have practiced it before. And you can catch them doing those rehearsals. And if you catch them saying something good, don't just think to yourself, oh, that's cute. Go there and tell them, I'm proud of you for saying that. That's a word of affirmation. Proud. It really empowers children with that sense of, when I do X, not only I'm not punished, but I'm told that I'm on the right path. On the flip side of this, words of affirmation must be done carefully. Meaning, if we just start to deploy pride over everything and anything, it loses its value, it dilutes its value, and ultimately the child will stop really giving it value, which defeats the purpose of the words of affirmation. These are words that would feed positive self-talk, right? You want to imprint that empowerment and that positivity and that ambition to do better and to seek fulfillment and positive relationships. Well, if the words lose their value, then you might actually see this backfire. The child might grow up to become a teenager who's cynical over these sorts of words and language. The way to override that is to combine words of affirmation with questioning. Now, I'm going to steal an idea from Gabor Mate, and I'm going to suggest that we use the ideas behind compassionate inquiry. This is not my idea. This is Gabor Mate's. You got to check him out. He's outstanding. He's a great thinker, and he's a fantastic academic in the field of trauma and parenting and psychology in general. He's also very into child development because of the issues of trauma. And the idea of compassionate inquiry is that you help someone navigate their thoughts and doubts and even negativity at times or self-consciousness by asking them why they feel the way they feel, and what can be done about it. And you take them on the journey of self-inquiry, but always with compassion, in the front seat. Eventually, the child will adopt this. If you do this early on, and I'm talking about 2, 3 years old, as soon as they start speaking, help them through these processes. Every night, when I put my kid to bed and we do our bedtime stories, then I ask him, what was your favorite thing about today? What was your least favorite thing about today? And what can we do tomorrow to have more of the favorites and less of the not favorites? So this is a process of self-awareness and recollection of events, but then also a process of what can we do better to avoid what we didn't like about today. Now that's a process of correction then. So on one hand, you're giving the child space to just say what they didn't like about the day, no judgment, all compassion. And then you help them think about, how can we avoid this tomorrow? What can you do to avoid that? For example, if the least favorite thing was, when you told me off when I did X, Y, or Z, and then you ask them, okay, so what can we do tomorrow to avoid that? Maybe I can ask you before I grab something off the shelf at the supermarket, or I can eat more quickly so we're not late for school. And they are doing the problem solving themselves instead of you pointing the finger and say, you have to do this way, you have to do that way, whatever that might be. Allow them to be the problem solvers, because trust me, kids are way more aware of this stuff than you think. I will do an episode on the multiple parts of our minds and how that develops and manifests itself in children, and how you can evoke that in children. But for now, I'll just say that just like adults, children have many minds, and you can work with their imagination and their ability to create different characters and personas in their minds to promote the creation of healthy personas. And you can do this by a compassionate inquiry. You can do this by stimulating openness and open-mindedness. And this is really how the inner self-talk is formed. So as I said, children speak to themselves a lot because they are rehearsing, and eventually that conversation goes internally or carries on internally. And that takes time for them to develop that, but the reality is that once that clicks and their ability to think rather than speak out loud becomes more competent, I would say that that's when, or at that point, everything that they've heard that so far, everything that they've practiced out loud, everything that they've observed you do in your day-to-day life, that becomes part of their self-talk. This is why when we grow up, we have an inner child inside our minds, because that's a voice that gets developed back then when we were a child, and it becomes a fundamental character in our mind's play. And the voice of our parents is also part of our personal voice, of our self-talk. It might sound like it's your voice, but it's using someone else's words. Now, they can be positive or negative. The reality is that there's no escaping that. What we observe, we steal. When we are aspiring to become like our role models, we're doing that out of survival. We are doing that out of biology. So as a parent, as an educator, we have to be very aware of when to smile, when to frown. It's not all, fun and games. Frowning and, instilling a certain understanding of where the limits are, like we talked about earlier. And that can be done sometimes with a bit of tough love. There's no problem. That's not wrong. It's just how you go about doing it and what's the sequence of events. If I tell my child off, do I then just let the child ruminate on it eternally whilst I'm still being all grumpy in the living room, and then I just, I snap out of it, so I assume that the child will as well? I don't believe that. I don't do that. If I tell my child off, then we will have a conversation, a calm one, a conversation about why we had that disconnection, why things didn't work out so well in that moment for the two of us. And that's how you create relationships, in open communication, honest communication. Nothing else matters. You have to engage in that dialogue. So it's important that you understand what not to say. It's important that you understand that you can't just lash out at your kid and expect no consequences, no trauma. Of course, trauma will occur. Trauma is any event that becomes so overwhelming that your emotions can't cope with it, and it just goes overboard, and it creates a stamp, and it creates a model for thinking and behaving. So it's also important that we understand that children are not deaf. As adults, we tend to look at children as always somewhat distracted in their own worlds, playing around, bouncing around. They seem to not really pay attention to anything you're saying. And yes, of course they get distracted. Of course their attention span is still developing. Of course they will look for at a toy and forget that you asked them to brush their teeth. That's part of the development. They can't do what they don't know how to do yet. However, they're not deaf. And what that means is that if you're talking to someone in the room next to theirs, and they hear you maybe shout or at each other, or cry, or call each other names, or being self-deprecating, they are absorbing all these words, all these ideas, all the energy. All of that is getting consumed. It doesn't matter if they seem to be happily playing with their toys. Don't be deluded. That's a coping mechanism. And as we know from the literature, children have different kinds of attachment. Right? There's several levels of how that happens, and that happens, those different kinds of attachment happens precisely because of that phase in their lives whilst they are observing adults and their behaviors and how they model that and then go with that into their own adulthood. And when they become adults, they have these different ways of coping. I'm not going to get into the specifics today, but there are many categories. One of them would be a disorganized the attachment style, let's call it, where the child and then the teenager and then the adult doesn't quite know how to react in proportion to what's happening in front of them. So even someone being affectionate might cause a negative reaction. So there's a disconnection. There's a disorganization, effectively. And that's got to do with the kind of trauma they were exposed to. We will get into all of that. Attachment, the different personas, the different minds that get developed over time, the depth of self-talk, and how many layers are we talking about here? Is it just the voice that thinks about what you should be buying for your dinner party today? That's one voice, that's self-talk. Is it the self-talk that calls you a loser when you simply forget to buy bread? Is it the self-talk that looks at yourself in the mirror and says you're a strong, beautiful woman? All of that is self-talk, and all of these voices come from different places and different levels of necessity. Let's call these different parts. These different parts play different roles, They have different origin stories. And I would strongly suggest that you patiently and with compassion explore yourself, explore your voices, explore your different parts, and then see how you interact with others. When you speak to someone else, the way you speak to someone else, how does that make you feel? And if you realize that when you talk about specific topics, it makes you feel a certain way, you might be dealing with a different part of yourself that it's not fully integrated yet, which is why it's deploying emotion. Not that you want to be without emotion, but you want to perhaps know and integrate those emotions in a functional way. Look for patterns. Even if you don't have kids, you were once a kid. So the last 30 minutes of this podcast also apply to you, even if you don't have kids or if you don't have students, if you're not an educator. It doesn't matter. You have been a student and you have been a kid. So think about this. Think about your self-talk. Where does it come from? Is it beneficial to you? Is it harmful to you, to others? How does that then manifest outwardly, right? Always spend time thinking about these things. And you might think it's a bit of a waste of time. That's probably one part of you saying that. And I respect that part of you. I have compassion for it. It's trying to protect you from pain. But it's not yourself. It's just another voice that's learned a pattern. In this case, it's a pattern of avoidance. And you'll have to hug it out, be compassionate, and then ask that voice, ask that part of you, why? Why is it avoiding self-knowledge? Why is it avoiding learning more about yourself, who you are about? That's today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed. And if you did, of course, I would truly appreciate if you were to subscribe. Follow me on all the social media stuff on Instagram as João Figueiredo Coach. And YouTube, subscribe. And that's it. Have a good week and stay well. Bye-bye.